Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling something really critical, the state of international aid. Now, often you hear it's about funding, right? A money problem.
hmm
But what our research is showing, digging into this, is actually a much deeper crisis. It's about narrative, about voice.
Exactly. It's like who actually gets to speak for whom, what stories are getting told, and maybe more importantly, which ones are just silenced.
Yeah, precisely.
So this deep dive, we're looking into what we're calling the architecture of voice in the aid sector.
Okay.
We want to unpack how communication isn't just, messaging. It's really a mirror reflecting these deep power structures.
So we'll look at things like the old savior-victim stories.
Yeah, those binaries, definitely. And also the very cautious sort of institutional language you often see, even how local voices sometimes get, outsourced or pushed aside, maybe without even meaning to.
But hopefully finding some glimmers of change, too.
Oh, absolutely. There are definitely signs things are shifting, and we'll get into those.
Great. And to do this, we've pulled together a really wide range of material. It's quite multi-layered.
Mm-hmm.
We've looked at institutional reports, the big players like UNHCR, Oxfam, the World Bank,
Yeah.
but also peer-reviewed academic research.
Yeah, including some really crucial feminist and intersectional critiques that challenge the usual ways of thinking.
And whistleblower accounts, too, which can be powerful. Media archives.
Insights from practitioners themselves, from dialogues on platforms like ALNAP webinars, even threads on X where people are discussing this stuff openly.
And we've really tried hard, haven't we, to challenge those Eurocentric assumptions.
We have. We paid particular attention to scholarship from the Global South, translated critiques from non-Anglophone regions where we could find them, trying to get a broader perspective.
So the approach is kind of a critical discourse lens,
Mm.
but maybe with a decolonizing edge.
That's a good way to put it. We're exploring how communication shapes power, shapes accountability, legitimacy, and how it's shaped by them. The goal here is critical reflection, really. Constructive reform, not just condemnation.
Okay, let's jump right in then. Communication strategies. This tightrope walk between accountability and, well, optics.
Right.
What's interesting is seeing this increasing emphasis on values-based communication. You hear words like dignity, resilience, partnership, much more now.
Absolutely. It reflects a real shift, or at least an attempted shift, towards more ethical, more inclusive practice.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. Look at the EU's humanitarian frameworks. They really foreground accountability now. Or UNICEF. Their narrative consistently highlights child protection, empowerment.
And organizations like MSF Oxfam.
Yeah, Médecins Sans Frontières, Oxfam. They've actually adopted specific ethical storytelling principles. Oxfam has its ethical content guidelines, for instance, trying to put dignity first.
Okay, but here's the kicker, isn't it? Despite these words, these commitments, there are still huge structural constraints. There's this gap.
There really is a persistent gap between the rhetoric and the reality on the ground.
Talk about digital tools, they seem promising, right? WhatsApp surveys, AI reporting.
They do seem promising, but here's the problem. If they're not co-designed with the affected populations, they can just end up reinforcing the old top-down way of doing things.
So it's not automatic progress.
Not at all. Take UNHCR's digital transformation strategy. It has strong commitments to rights-based digital innovation, which is great. But analysts still raised really valid concerns about data privacy, algorithmic bias, who even has access to this tech.
Mm.
And then you have these internal filters, linguistic filters, editorial ones, strategic ones. Often they prioritize making things sound coherent for donors over capturing the messy, complex reality.
Like that UNHCR WhatsApp hotline idea.
Exactly. It's a potentially good tool, but does the feedback actually change decisions upstream? That's the real test,
So it becomes about who's shaping the message and if it's actually getting through.
Right. And sometimes, honestly, with limited resources, maybe communication teams being separate from program planning. Communication can get reduced to just optics.
Optics?
Meaning polished outputs. Stuff that emphasizes impact, makes everything look good, but maybe downplays the complexity or even failures. Window dressing, essentially.
Right, that's discouraging.
It can be, but as I said, there are glimmers of change. We are seeing pushback.
Like what?
Well, some UNHCR digital campaigns in 2025, they really did feature refugee-led storytelling, and you have NGOs piloting co-authorship models.
Authorship. So local partners taking the lead on the public story.
Yes, exactly. Oxfam's feminist humanitarian approach is pushing in that direction. It's about shifting that power.
So if these tools, digital AI, if they aren't just about being faster or cheaper, what's the real potential?
The real potential, the transformative part, isn't automating things. It's about redistributing authorship, redistributing access, narrative authority.
Ah, okay.
But that takes real intention. It needs safeguards, like the ones in UNHCR's AI ethics toolkit, to make sure it's equitable. It doesn't just happen.
That makes sense. And it leads us right into another really deep-seated issue,
Hmm.
that savior versus victim thing.
Oh, yeah. That binary, it's everywhere.
Campaign visuals, right? It's almost a formula. The vulnerable woman, the barefoot child, the destroyed landscape,
Hmm.
images designed to pull at heartstrings, get donations.
And we have to be honest, these narratives, they've worked operationally, they've been effective, they've helped raise billions. Think about the responses in Syria, Ukraine in 2022, 2023. They mobilize people fast.
But the big question is, just because it's effective, does that make it ethically sound?
That's the crux of it, isn't it? Because when you look closer, that narrative simplifies everything. It creates these really rigid, unequal roles.
The competent rescuer, usually Western,
Acting on behalf of the passive victim, often non-Western.
and scholars from the Global South have really critiqued this, haven't they?
Very strongly. They argue it flattens nuance, ignores local agency, and just reinforces those old power imbalances.
And what about the impact on the people receiving aid? How does it affect them?
Well, it often traps them in these narratives of dependency. They're framed through pity, not dignity. Their own strength, their resilience, it gets overlooked, eclipsed.
Which could lead to feeling helpless, undermining their own community's efforts.
Exactly. It can really erode that sense of self-efficacy. And then there's the donor side.
Right, what some call weaponized compassion.
Yeah, it's a provocative term, but it points to how emotional manipulation can get baked into fundraising. It ends up elevating the giver's identity almost as much as addressing the need.
Which could, maybe weirdly, even lead to resentment down the line.
Potentially. And look, it's crucial to say this stuff usually doesn't come from a place of malice.
No.
No, it's often legacy systems, expectations, visual habits, plus immense pressure on comms teams to raise money to compete for attention. It's systemic.
But alternatives are emerging. You mentioned UNICEF earlier.
Yes, their 2025 Voices of Change campaign in Ethiopia, it specifically positioned young people, local leaders as authors, not just subjects. That's a shift.
And participatory media hubs. Co-authored content.
We're seeing more of that. It's really encouraging.
So the way forward isn't no more stories.
Definitely not. Storytelling is vital. It's about reimagining the ethics, investing in narratives that show complexity, that center interdependence, that elevate agency without, romanticizing hardship.
And this isn't just a comms issue, is it?
Not at all. It's a governance issue. It shapes how we respond, how laws are made, how funding flows. It's fundamental.
That ethical dimension really makes you think about who else is involved. Which brings us to the private sector.
Yes. The complex relationship?
It feels like a paradox, doesn't it? On one hand, there's deep skepticism, sometimes distrust. On the other, undeniable reliance.
It's absolutely a paradox, and the concerns are real and ongoing in 2025. Things like greenwashing.
Companies using partnerships to look good environmentally while still having issues.
Exactly. Fossil fuel links, for example. There have been lawsuits, EU regulations pushing back, and then there are fears about data privacy, algorithmic bias, especially with things like biometric registration or AI targeting.
These often frame private companies as somehow separate from or even opposed to humanitarian principles.
Right, but then you look at the operational reality.
And they're deeply embedded.
Completely. So many core functions depend on private infrastructure now.
Like what?
Well, think about blockchain for aid distribution. Piloted in West and Central Africa in 2025, places like WFP using it. It cut fraud, sped up delivery, made access more secure.
Okay.
Or AI for cholera surveillance in Chad. A private-public tech partnership built that, providing early warnings, literally saving lives.
So for the private sector, it's innovation, social contribution.
That's often the framing, yes.
Yeah.
You have platforms like the Private Sector Humanitarian Alliance promoting these tools.
But from a global south perspective.
The concerns are different. Asymmetrical power, data sovereignty, who owns the data,
Right.
and becoming dependent on tech ecosystems based, usually, in the global north.
And these tensions, they don't always make it into the public communication.
Often not, because organizations worry about reputational risk. They want to highlight their mission, their independence,
So they selectively communicate.
which can hide how interdependent things actually are and reinforce stereotypes. This gets really amplified with climate finance.
How so?
Aid groups are rightly calling out fossil fuel-linked philanthropy, but at the same time, public funding is shrinking, so they become more dependent on that very money they're critiquing. It's a real bind.
Are things evolving, though? Are there signs of progress in 2025?
There are big meetings like the Humanitarian Networks and Partnerships Weeks. They're fostering more open dialogue. Alliances like the PSHA are trying out ways to track ethical compliance.
So the way forward isn't just one-off partnerships.
No, it needs deeper cultural and structural alignment, moving beyond this binary of us versus them, understanding everyone's part of a shared ecosystem, but making sure there's equity and mutual accountability.
Which brings us, I think, to where this gap between words and actions really hits home. The contradictions between stated values and daily practice.
Yeah, this is where it gets stark. Organizations talk about localization, anti-racism, equity in their strategies.
Beautiful language.
Exactly. But on the ground, those aspirations often stumble.
Why does that happen? Is it bad faith?
Not always, I don't think. It often stems from really entrenched incentives, short-term funding cycles that demand quick, measurable results.
Okay.
The pressure to maintain neutrality, which can discourage taking clear political stances even when needed. Centralized communication aiming for brand consistency. Sanitized messaging. Stuff that works for fundraising maybe, but can erode trust with communities. And you see this pattern. Accountability flows upwards to donors much more easily than it flows downwards to the people actually affected.
And we see this playing out in specific crises, right? This isn't just abstract.
No, it's very concrete. Take Gaza, the 2025 funding crisis. Reports showed a deliberate shift in humanitarian language towards depoliticized logistics talk.
Avoiding words like occupation or siege.
Precisely, which alienated local communities. They felt abandoned by the narrative. And Sudan. In 2024-2025, local groups were absolutely vital in preventing famine. But in the big international communications, often overshadowed, sometimes completely omitted, it reproduced marginalization just in narrative form.
Wow, what about Afghanistan?
Post-2021, communications became extremely risk-averse on gender. References to women's rights were scaled back. Afghan women's own voices were systematically underrepresented.
We saw similar things in Yemen. Sanitized narratives.
Yeah, funding stories that scrubbed out politically tricky elements like coalition interference. The effect was grassroots groups became invisible on the global stage.
And Ethiopia, this idea of performative localization.
Right, using the language of empowerment but keeping editorial control firmly centralized. Donor expectations basically became the narrative North Star, guiding everything.
Haiti, too, a trade-off between operations and representation.
A really tough one. Sidelining Haitian civil society from telling their own stories because of perceived risk, essentially trading narrative legitimacy to keep the institutional machine running.
Look, these examples, they don't mean the organizations aren't doing vital work.
Absolutely not. They play a crucial role.
But it sharpens the contradiction, doesn't it? This isn't just poor messaging.
No, it points to a governance failure. Narrative power is concentrated at HQ. Risk aversion ends up codifying exclusion.
But she said change is happening at the margins.
It is. Local actors are pushing back, piloting participatory content, co-authoring stories, launching their own independent media platforms. They're demanding visibility, equity, editorial control. It's a structural demand now.
So how do we balance this? How do we move forward? It sounds like it involves bringing different pieces together. Donor frameworks, private sector input, community leadership.
Exactly. The thinking is that a more equitable, transparent, resilient system can emerge when those things strategically converge, rather than pulling in opposite directions.
Let's talk donor KPIs, key performance indicator. They're meant for accountability, right? Measuring impact.
They are, and that's critical, especially with ODA official development assistance projected to fall by maybe 9 to 17% by the end of 2025. Money is tight.
And there's evidence they help efficiency.
Some studies show organizations that regularly review and adapt their KPIs report up to 20% greater efficiency. So they have value.
But the downside?
They often miss the non-quantifiable stuff, like how do you measure local narrative authorship easily, or building trust. These things often get left out of the boxes you have to tick.
So there's a push to change the metrics.
There is, particularly among groups signed up to the Grand Bargain Principles. They're advocating for recalibrating KPIs to include localization metrics, like what percentage of funding actually goes through local partners, how much narrative control do they have?
Okay, and the private sector, not just suppliers anymore.
Increasingly, they're co-creators of technical solutions.
Examples.
Well, the World Economic Forum's 2025 updates talk a lot about blockchain supply chains, like the WFP pilots we mentioned, enhancing traceability, cutting fraud.
And UNHCR using stablecoins.
Yeah, that's a big one. Projected to handle over 2 billion USD by late 2025. It's fundamentally reshaping how financial aid flows in displacement contexts.
But the need for ethical oversight remains crucial.
Absolutely vigilant oversight to prevent greenwashing or partnerships that are more extractive than collaborative.
And what about community-led models? There's often skepticism they can scale up.
That skepticism is being seriously challenged. Look at Shining Hope for Communities, SOFCO, in Kenya. By mid-2025, reaching around 4 million people across 40 counties, they won the UN Mandela Prize in 2025. That's scale.
Now, and Ukraine.
National organizations doing cash transfers were found to be up to 32% more cost-efficient and had higher trust levels from beneficiaries. That's despite cash values being cut by 20% in mid-2025.
So these models work, and hybrid approaches too.
Yeah, gaining traction in Bangladesh, West Africa, Latin America, mixing international support with local leadership.
So it's not about choosing one model over another.
Maybe less about choosing and more about strategically aligning them. You need co-governed metrics, ethical tech partnerships, and properly supported, scaled-up local stewardship. Those seem foundational.
Okay, let's step back a bit. Why does all this communication stuff matter structurally? Let's look at the different dimensions historically.
Historically, aid communication, even as it's changed, still carries echoes of its colonial roots, doesn't it?
How so?
It often reflects this hierarchical view. The giver is central, the receiver is peripheral. Even today's super polished campaigns can sometimes replicate those visual hierarchies, influencing how we perceive crises and where funding goes.
And sociologically, how does it play out within organizations?
Well, communication often mirrors and reinforces the internal hierarchies, expats frequently being the main spokespeople, local staff perhaps quoted more briefly.
Right.
This shapes the culture of the sector. It acts as a kind of gatekeeping mechanism for who gets to represent the work, though, again, there are movements towards more relational approaches challenging that.
Economically, we touched on donor pressure.
Yeah, the demand for visibility, efficiency, return on investment, it profoundly influences storytelling, creating pressure for simplicity, for success stories.
Which risks turning suffering into a fundraising asset.
That's the danger. But to be fair, those same KPIs and donor frameworks have also driven improvements in measuring impact and increasing transparency. It's complicated.
And ethically. This feels like the heart of it.
It really does. There are such tough, unresolved questions. Who owns a story, especially when power differences are huge? What does consent really mean in those contexts? How do you protect dignity when success might depend on viral clicks?
Images taken in trauma can stay with people forever.
Exactly. It demands really robust safeguards, a fundamental shift away from extracting narratives towards genuinely co-creating them.
And contemporarily, what's happening right now?
What's fascinating now is the disruption of narrative control. Displaced people, diaspora communities, youth activists, they're not waiting for permission.
They're using their own platforms. TikTok, X, encrypted messaging.
Yes. Bypassing the traditional gatekeepers. Telling raw, unfiltered stories. These counter-narratives, they shift the focus from pity towards power, towards agency. It offers a glimpse, maybe, of a more plural, participatory communication landscape. A decolonized one, perhaps?
So amidst all these challenges, are there concrete signs of reform?
Yeah.
Emerging shifts we can point to?
Definitely. There's quantifiable progress. UNHCR's digital platforms now track feedback resolution rates. They're targeting 70–80% closure. Oxfam has a goal, 40% locally authored communications by 2026. These are measurable targets.
And local NGOs taking control.
Yes, reclaiming narrative agency, launching their own media hubs, their own storytelling platforms. We're seeing this in Kenya, Palestine, DRC, Sudan, Ethiopia. It's happening.
What about training for aid workers?
That's shifting too. Collaborations with feminist scholars, indigenous thinkers, decolonial academics are reshaping how communication staff are trained in some big organizations like MSF and parts of the EU system, introducing power analysis, anti-racism frameworks.
Digital tools are enabling this too.
Digital pluralism, yeah. Simple things like voice notes, community radio, encrypted apps, they're democratizing information flow, allowing for collective storytelling, amplifying voices that were previously unheard.
And AI. You mentioned it earlier.
It's being piloted for good and for equity. UNICEF, WFP testing AI for things like multilingual translation, analyzing sentiment and feedback. And more advanced AI is being looked at for detecting bias in communications or predicting equity gaps in program delivery.
And new voices gaining influence.
Absolutely. Youth activists, diaspora leaders, Global South storytellers, they are shaping the conversation now, often outside the formal aid structures. Think TikTok campaigns related to Ukraine or diaspora-led comms driving awareness about Sudan. They're challenging the old tropes.
But there's a catch, isn't there? Despite these positive signs.
There is. The structural limits persist. That projected ODA decline 9 to 17% in 2025. That hurts. Geopolitical fragmentation makes things harder. Communication budgets often remain siloed within organizations, and centralized editorial control is still a major barrier to scaling up these reforms.
Okay, so let's bring this all together as we wrap up.
The key takeaway really is that communication in aid isn't just an add-on, an accessory. It's the actual scaffolding. It shapes the culture, it encodes power, it defines accountability.
It dictates whose voices get heard, how we even understand crises.
Exactly. And given the sheer scale of the humanitarian funding crisis in 2025, I mean, only 16.8% of the needed $45.48 billion funded for 181 million people. That's staggering.
Amidst rising conflicts, economic shocks.
Right. In that context, communication has to change. It has to move beyond just representing communities.
Towards actively collaborating with them.
Yes. Their agency, their voice, has to shape not just the story, but the actual decisions, the strategies being implemented.
So this requires real leadership. Courage.
Clarity and courage, definitely. Across
Yeah.
the whole sector, communication reform can't stay in its little box. It has to be embedded in governance, in strategy, in funding models.
Co-created with local actors.
And anchored in humility and respect, that's crucial.
So for you, our listener, maybe a final thought to chew on. Legitimacy in this sector, it's not going to be rebuilt just through better branding or slicker campaigns.
No, it's going to come from listening, really listening. Yielding narrative space, working together across roles, across sectors, across borders. The story of aid is still being written.
And it has to be co-authored, with equity, not hierarchy, right at the very core.